Hi, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange. Today I want to do a video talking about where to start if you want to get into reading horror. This is going to be a general discussion, my thoughts on the topic, and then I'm going to do a follow-up video where I'm going to recommend specific books. So these are just my opinions, things that have helped me get into the genre, and hopefully will be some good advice for other people who are in the mood, especially this time of year, to read something dark and creepy, but just don't know where to start or a little bit nervous to get into horror. Newer subscribers might actually be surprised to know that I actually wasn't reading a lot of horror even like 3-4 years ago. I didn't consider myself a horror reader, but I got into the genre and have just fallen in love with it. So I definitely hope that a lot of the advice I can give you can really help you out, and I'd love to know if you try any of my suggestions and what you think. So first I want to talk about classics, and this might be a little bit controversial, but I actually don't recommend starting with horror classics unless perhaps you are someone who absolutely enjoys and loves reading classics in every genre. I know a lot of people say that in order to get into a genre, you need to know the foundations, but I actually think that you should wait until you've fallen in love with the genre and then go back and kind of read the older pieces and find out the history of the genre. So I don't actually recommend starting with horror classics. You obviously can do whatever you want, but for me, those weren't the places I started, and I found some of those books a little more dense, a little more dry, and I definitely am going to be recommending more modern books in my follow-up video, so stay tuned for that. My next recommendation is actually to read short stories or novellas, because I believe that horror works so well in the short form, and this has a lot to do with the fact that I think it's really hard to keep a story really creepy over 500 plus pages, but a short story or even a novella you can read in one sitting, and they're just very tightly written and they usually have a really good punch, and so I just think it works really well. And even if you're someone who doesn't normally enjoy short stories, don't worry, I actually hate short stories in every other genre. I do not enjoy them whatsoever unless it's horror. So even if you have your biases towards short stories already, give horror short stories a try. I personally love them, and they were some of my favorite stories I read last year. Were like 20 pages long and were just absolutely brilliant. So definitely recommend it. And plus, it's not a big time commitment. So if you're just wanting to try out the genre, you're not committing to like some giant tome that's going to take you the entire month to read. My next point is to talk about scariness. One of the major reasons I hear people not want to read horror is because they call themselves scaredy cats and they're just not interested in scary books. But I want to let you know a secret that a lot of people don't realize, that not all horror books are truly scary in the way you would imagine. I think a lot of people have preconceived ideas that every single horror book is like reading the movie Saw on the page, and a lot of horror doesn't actually involve gross out horror or body horror. I do enjoy those elements, but there are plenty of horror stories that are just mildly creepy, that play with weird ideas, but are not necessarily creepy to the reader, and specifically not creepy to every reader. So I would say look at reviews, get recommendations. If you want to read a creepy story, definitely seek those out. Seek out books that play into your fears. If you're afraid of clowns, consider reading a book about clowns. But if you are looking to read a horror book but don't want to be uncomfortable, consider reading a book that doesn't necessarily sound scary to you. There's plenty in the genre that still count as horror, but are what we call in the podcast room temperature. And that's another recommendation. I'm going to shamelessly plug the podcast here and say that, again, I do a podcast with Stephanie called Books in the Freezer, and that is an excellent way to find out about more horror books. We actually did a fantastic episode on where to start with horror, which was with our guest April from Getting Higgy With It. So I'm going to link that all down below. but those are just some really good ways to get into the genre. So I definitely recommend deciding whether or not you want to be scared, or if you don't, looking for a book that is a little bit more mild, and they're definitely out there. I've read plenty of horror books that did not scare me whatsoever. And my last recommendation is to find a subgenre that interests you. For a lot of people, including myself, they will go and just pick up some random horror story, but it may or may not necessarily be a subgenre that you actually find interesting. For myself, I started by reading a lot of haunted house stories, very subtle, quiet horror, and I realized that that is not my personal flavor. I do enjoy something a little more robust, a little more gross out, and so I eventually started to find stories that worked with my personal reading taste. And so I really encourage you that if you think possession stories are stupid, don't read one, because you're gonna find it stupid. Or if you love the idea of a haunted house, then those might be stories you're more drawn to, even though they didn't necessarily work for me. And so I definitely recommend just basically trying out and seeing what works for you. So those are my general recommendations where to start with the horror genre. I'm not surprised you might be hoping to get some specific recommendations, so definitely hang in there. I will be coming back with a follow-up video giving you some specific recommendations that I personally think are really good to start with it. But again, it's such a personal genre. What is scary to one person is not scary to someone else, that you kind of have to explore it for yourself. So I wanted to start with some general recommendations before I attempt to give you very specific books to try out. So I would love to know for yourself what works for you. What recommendations do you give when you have friends or family asking you where to start with the genre? Do you agree or disagree with my advice? It's all good, so I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, and stay tuned for part 2 of my Where to Start with Horror series. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.